Hi, welcome to the 4th Annual Easton Book Festival, weekend 2. We kicked off last night. It was really cool downtown. We had monster parades and all kinds of crazy stuff, and you never know what to expect here at the Easton Book Festival. Today, and right at this moment, we have a really, really awesome guy coming up here. He has done more for the book festival than I can even mention. He's currently the president of the festival board, and also a professor here at Lafayette, the head of the English department. So he and I have a long relationship. He's going to present his book, The Hymnal, and yeah. All right, I'll welcome Chris Phillips.
Well, thanks so much, Daryl, and thanks everyone for being here. Thanks also to our sponsors. You know, this is my little board member thing that I'll do for them. Lafayette College, wonderful to have them as a named sponsor this year. Also the Lafayette Humanities Center, the Book and Puppet Company downtown, Kelly Nissan, the IRCO Credit Union, and we actually have quite a list. It's more local partners than the festival has ever had. It seems just getting bigger and bigger each year, and especially this year, returning to so much in-person programming is really exciting. And thanks again to Daryl, as well as Lynn Alexander, another board member, who have chaired our programming committee and put together just amazing stuff for us to see. I'm thrilled to get to be a part of it. One thing we realized this year is Daryl and I think have been on the board for 3 years now out of the 4. So has Lynn, and we realized that none of us, even though we all publish books, have ever been at the festival as an author. We've been at the festival in pretty much every other capacity, but not actually talking about our writing. So last weekend we had a great poetry reading with Daryl, one of the featured readers, Lynn as one of the featured readers. We had Nancy Scott. We had just a great lineup, and now I am very honored to get to be part of this series. So the book that Daryl mentioned, The Hymnal, A Reading History, is what I'm going to be reading a little bit from, talking a bit about how this book came to be, what the idea was behind it, and a little bit of the response. I am, as Daryl said, a professor. I tend to write in academic contexts for university presses. This book is published by Johns Hopkins, and in previous publishing ventures, it's generally been academic audiences or where I focus. And this book was written for more of a crossover audience, and that was reflected in the fact it was reviewed in Christianity Today, American Literary History, which is one of the big academic journals in my field, and the Wall Street Journal. And everybody was like, this wasn't quite what I thought it was going to be. So that's part of the joy of learning to be a crossover author is, nobody's entirely happy, nobody's entirely clear on what's going on, but you get to talk with a lot of different people. And that's a really delightful thing to get to do. So I'll read the first couple of pages, which introduce a little bit of what the book is about, and then I'll explain a little bit of some of the ins and outs of what this is getting at. Who reads a hymnal? Hardly anyone today, and that has been the case for at least a century of English language religious practice. Even singing from hymnals is now on the decline as congregations increasingly move to projecting the lyrics of hymns and praise songs on large screens. Recapturing the importance of hymnals was apparently already a concern by 1978, when an issue of Hymn, the Journal of the Hymn Society of the United States and Canada, included a public service announcement intended for photocopying and including in church bulletins, titled 30 Ways You Use Your Hymnal! The one-page, somewhat tongue-in-cheek list included entries focused on the practical uses of a large book as an object: a doorstop, booster seat for children, a toy to slide down a pew and crash to the floor. Some uses, such as singing, were clearly acceptable to do openly. Others, such as passing notes in church, were not. The books could be stolen for home use, since they were not generally available for individual purchase. They were too expensive for most people to want to buy one anyway. And of course, they could be used in worship. But beyond looking up information about a specific hymn, simply reading the books did not make the list. That was too far beyond the horizon of possibilities in 1978. A century earlier, however, the situation was far different. By the late 1870s, hymnals had begun to take the form we recognize today, with music and text appearing on pages together. That now seems intuitive, but worshipers in 1878 were in the middle of a generation-long struggle over the nature, purpose, and shape of a hymnal. Until the 1850s, books for congregational use had almost universally excluded music. Instead, the hands of worshipers throughout North America and the UK cradled pocket-sized collections of hymn texts, and only the choirs and accompanists had printed tunes. These early collections, generally called hymn books, were privately owned and carried from home to church and back again. They traveled to schools, to offices, to fields, and to markets. They provided devotional material and early literacy instruction. They forged bonds between friends and family members, and they proclaimed the identities of the churches that used them beyond the walls of their buildings. Adding music changed all that. In an effort to improve congregational singing, reform-minded clergy, such as Henry Ward Beecher, Harry Beecher Stowe's brother, introduced books that included music alongside the texts. In an attempt at a compromise between reading and singing, Beecher's Plymouth Collection and others like it gave only the first stanzas interlined with the music, leaving the other stanzas unbroken by musical notation. And yet these books proved so unpopular at first that even the most successful hymnals, the term attached to these new music-filled books, also appeared in words-only forms. The price and weight of the books had increased dramatically, and the visual distraction of the music staffs threatened to undo a century and a half of a multifaceted reading culture that had built up around a book that sat beside the Bibles in hundreds of thousands of English-speaking households. By 1878, the singing reformers were gaining the upper hand, partly thanks to a generation of Sunday school graduates who had learned singing in their childhood classes using the old hymn books, and who thus brought a new standard of musical literacy to congregations as adults. Those singers remembered a culture of reading that had followed them into many of their lives' most significant spaces and relationships. By 1978, that memory was gone. This book reaches back to that older form of the hymnal, the hymn book, the small companion that carried human-authored texts on divine subjects to and with their owners. Visiting the three sacred spaces of church, school, and home in the chapters that follow, I explore the rise and maturing of a robust reading culture. From the adoption of congregational hymns alongside older psalm singing practices around 1700 to the appearance of the new style of hymnals, this culture merged older devotional traditions with new relationships to media, both sacred and secular, as hymn books went nearly everywhere print culture could reach. To speak of a reading history of the hymnal, as this volume's title does, thus means to search past the uniformly bound books in their pew racks, what we call hymnals today, to their older, smaller, more individuated forms. Much of this book wrestles with the fact that reading itself is largely invisible. Even in the present day, the attempt to articulate what it is we actually do when we read, physically, cognitively, emotionally, spiritually, serves to show how enigmatic reading is. This mystery deepens when we look into reading of the past, since the marginal notes and written first-hand accounts of reading that survive are by definition anomalies. Generalizing from these special cases is perilous work. Visual depictions of reading have the further challenge of being idealized scenes. One of the things I talk about in the book is images that show these books being used. Ones that can tell us much about the values of artists and their cultures, but may easily distort our ideas of what really happened. And yet the desire to know, to connect with readers of the past, and so understand something of our own reading experiences today, draws scholars and book enthusiasts back to the special cases, the ideal images. Most of this book will focus on the book as artifact, evidence, and clue. And so let us meet the books that will guide us into that world. So to do a little bit of that right now, based on what I just read, this is a hymnal. It's got music, it's got words, and this one did not live in a house. It's stamped on the front, Stamford Baptist Church, 1860. This is a book that came out right before the Civil War, about 1859, called The Sabbath Hymn and Tune Book. Lowell Mason, who was one of the most influential sacred music composers in America in the 19th century, he wrote the tune we now sing to Joy to the World at Christmas, Nearer My God to Thee, a number of other tunes that a lot of people would recognize. Mason was the music editor for this particular collection, but a lot of people did not want a book that looked like this. They said, okay, Lowell Mason, we'll sing your tunes, but we don't want to see them. So mostly people bought the Sabbath Hymn Book. This is the music-less edition of the exact same title. So all the words are there, but not the music. So hymnal to hymn book. And most of what the book talks about is this kind of thing, which has led a lot of people to say, well, why didn't you just call it the hymn book? Which is exactly what I asked my editor. And he said, well, nobody knows what a hymn book is. If you put hymnal on it, people will be interested in hymnals and buy it, which has happened, and a lot of people then got annoyed because I wanted to hear about the big book. Why are you talking about the small book? Well, this is the way it goes sometimes. But part of what fascinates me about this is that in-betweenness. The thing that got me started in this project was coming across a book in graduate school in my school's special collections library that had on the title page, Divine Hymns and Spiritual Songs for the Use of Religious Assemblies and Private Christians. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Like, how do you make something for an assembly, which is public, but also for private Christians? I don't know of very many books that can do both of those. So I kind of tucked that away for a few years, and I worked on other things for my dissertation and some other publications that I was working on. And when I got to thinking about what I wanted my next book to be, I had gotten really interested in the history of the book, how they're made, how they're used, what happens with the physical things over the course of their lifetime. And I thought, okay, this is the story I want to tell, the story of these books and the people that lived with them. And it turned out there had been very little work done on this. Hymns are popular for musicologists to work on. So again, if you're interested in Lowell Mason, you can find stuff on Lowell Mason. There's some stuff in denominational history, like Methodist historians like to write about what Charles Wesley was up to. You might find Presbyterian and Baptist writers who are interested in Fanny Crosby or Isaac Watts or some of these other really famous hymn writers. But what ordinary people are doing with these collections that went everywhere, that you could buy in general stores, you could buy in your church, you could find in your school, you could find just about anywhere across the 17 and 1800s, people hadn't really done that. And so this set me on a quest. I wound up buying some of my own stuff to work with, because these books are still out there and they don't cost all that much, because again, these aren't thought of as collector's items. They're just family heirlooms or random throwaways. People don't really know what to do with them. And I wound up working in about 24 different libraries in the US and the UK to look through what these collections had to offer in terms of how these books were designed, but also what kinds of things can I find in these books that might tell me about the lives that were lived with them. So that's the next piece that I want to share a little bit about some of my favorite living that has been connected with these particular books. I'll quickly summarize where the first couple of pages of this chapter on how hymn books work at church is going on, and then I'll read some accounts of what I found. So there are two main ways that people would interact with these books in church. One is you own your own copy. It pretty much always starts with you own your own copy. Churches would adopt these books the way that professors adopt textbooks. They would say, this is what we're using, you go get one. And you might keep it at home and then bring it to church with you. If you're at one of the more affluent churches in this era, one of the big income streams is pew rentals. And these could be handed down through families, so that there's this big, if people are fired up today about this person's in my seat at church, like that was it was a financial deal back then. And so people might buy books just to leave in the family pew that will be waiting for you when you arrive for services. So then what do you do once you actually get there? One of the things that people would do is a very particular kind of record keeping. You might put the date of when a hymn was sung in the margin to say, we sang this one October 29th, 1852, or something like that. Somebody might also include alongside of that, here's the sermon that was preached that day, here's the text, here's the preacher, so that you actually start to get this kind of running record, a journal essentially, of what your church is up to in its day-to-day and week-to-week life. Not the way church history has usually been told. It's usually told from the top down. This is kind of bottom-up history. What are the people in the room all together actually doing together? And so this is where I pick up how that's happening and some of the things that result from that. This hymn historiography generally required the presence of writing implements, most frequently pencils, in the church, along with the book and congregants. It thus required some foresight and often some means to keep these records, since the larger format hymn books were the best for marking in this way, rather than the cheaper and more popular pocket-sized formats. You could get big type as well as small type, just like in a lot of books today. Marking in the margins of these books created a new reading experience, one that gave more emphasis to the hymns that the community actually used, visualizing a canon of practice that led the eye through the book. Not everyone who handled these books appreciated the effect, however. The dates carried their own visual weight and could distract from the text. Tensions over this practice occasionally flared between Henry Onderdonk Jr. and his daughter Elizabeth at First Presbyterian Church in Jamaica, Long Island. The father was a noted antiquarian and a founder of the Long Island Historical Society, but it seems that the daughter was the historian in church. At one point, Henry seems to have lost patience with Elizabeth's practice of filling their book's margins with dates, for he wrote in the gutter of one page, quote, "Don't mark this book anymore," end quote. The hymn alongside it was Isaac Watts's "How sad our state by nature is, our sin how deep it stains." What Henry took to be the staining sin of his daughter's commentary had proven to be too much for him. Elizabeth's name appears in ink on the book's front end paper. That's those blank papers that kind of flap around inside the cover. Could she have taken what Henry considered undue liberty with his property? Could the book have become her property after Henry considered it unusable? In a larger format copy of the same Presbyterian hymn book, Henry signed his name on the title page with the date December 14, 1861. At age 57, he may have preferred the larger print of this format. He also signed his name on the front end paper, the same place he had written Elizabeth's name in the smaller book. Underneath, the name is repeated, but in a much more stylized form with a type style capital H and copperplate lettering, though all done in pencil. So it looks like print, but it's been written out. Was this Henry's idea of decorating his book? Was it Elizabeth's? In any case, on the flyleaf facing these signatures appear several lines in two different hands. Quote, "What are you laughing at? Bumblebee has struck an attitude." End quote. Father and daughter, restricted by the culture of silence during the church service, found that the hymn book provided space to have a conversation. As annoyed as Henry was by Elizabeth's record keeping in the other book, he initiated this conversation, provoked by annoyance and curiosity over his daughter's lack of decorum in laughing or stifling a laugh. Elizabeth's cryptic, witty response to her father's question uses a nickname for a fellow congregant, Bumblebee, to pun on beatitude, displaying a quick sense of humor reminiscent of Emily Dickinson. While striking, the Onderdonk example of conversing in hymn books is far from unique. One particularly chatty family was the Haggers of First Parish, Weston, in Massachusetts. The pew owner, Nathan Hager, born Nathan Hager Jr., had moved from his prosperous farm to become a partner in his father-in-law Isaac Hobbs's tannery and shoe factory, eventually taking over the business after Hobbs's death. Hager was a pillar of the Weston community, representing the traditions of the town's old families. For the last 15 years of his life, he served as town clerk, following his father, his father-in-law, and his grandfather-in-law in that office. His son and 4 daughters shared a pew with Hager and his wife, Mary Ann, and the family copy of Greenwood's collection of psalms and hymns included dutiful notations of the dates when hymns were sung, who preached and on what texts, and brief passages for meditation, such as one headed "The Church" on the front end paper, quote, "the collective strength of discipleship which Christ might own on the earth," end quote. Later excerpts included poetic calls to action, such as Sarah Bolton's "Awake to Effort," Robert Herrick's "To the Virgins to Make Much of Time," and Adelaide Proctor's "Now," suggesting the thin line between sentimental poetry and devotional verse in the mid-19th century. The name Mary, Hager's eldest daughter, appears below the church passage, and then another hand writes lengthwise, quote, "That duet must remind Mr. Baldwin of Miss Adams and Miss Adelia Ryan," end quote. The hand of the church passage responds, quote, "Perhaps he thinks more of Cooper," end quote, who would have been the author of the text that was being sung in church. A conversation has broken out among marks of ownership and aids to devotion with competing goals. A focus on the matter of the service, or on the relationships among the congregants with their memories, histories, and intrigues. While the former is greatly in evidence throughout the book, on the fly leaves the latter is at least as central. Comments on the service itself focus on style rather than on content. Quote, "I wish Mr. Sears would pronounce to, not te." By the way, that's the Reverend Edmund Sears who wrote "It Came Upon the Midnight Clear." You don't get no respect. And when a neighbor brings their dog to church, quote, "Fortunate he is accustomed to hear music, I am afraid he would howl," end quote. Other comments focus on fashion. Quote, "Mrs. Horatio Fisher has got a new bonnet," end quote. And a favorite game among the family seems to have been tracing clues in facial features for family connections. Quote, "Ellen Stearns looks at this distance like Mrs. Frank Cutter, and that lady in Hastings' pew next but one to the head looks like the Damon family," end quote. While there is evidence of erasure on several fly leaves and nearly all the writing on the rear end paper has been crossed out, the Hager's silent conversations survived through the generations until the book entered the Damon family. Anne Hager, the second daughter, married a Damon. Had she been the one remarking on her future relation? And her daughter Alice gave the book to the American Antiquarian Society in 1942. There's no way of telling what Alice Damon thought of her ancestors' hymn book habits, but her willingness to preserve and donate the book suggests that she didn't entirely disapprove. Another copy of Greenwood, owned by the Hagers, contains further snippets of gossip about the identity of visitors, their professions, and their travels, as well as the underlined injunction, quote, "You ought to stay awake," end quote. While attention was not equally focused in the Hager pew, the family's hymn books have left traces of the lively times they had in the silent, sacred space of the church pew. So there are other points where I talk about gift inscriptions. My favorite one is written by, I presume, a young man in St. Louis in the 1850s, where he writes, "William S. Cuddy from himself," and gives the date. Which helps to convey this sense that it was so common for these things to be gift items that if you buy one for yourself, you might as well just go ahead and write that, because that's what people do in those books. There are a number of different kind of storage practices that people use. They slip letters into these for safekeeping. They slip holy cards. They slip communion tickets, which a lot of churches used to require for people to be allowed to go forward to receive communion. The most extreme example of this that I saw was one of the founders of First Presbyterian Scranton, who had glued an envelope into the back cover of his book and kept in their newspaper clippings about a lawsuit between the Board of Elders and the Board of Trustees at another church over who had the right to fire the organist. And I can only imagine how long he carried this around and why he was taking this to church with him every single week. But, you know, people, you do what you have to do in these kinds of books. Something else that tended to happen with these books was books would be created often for very particular and often urgent reasons. So the Sabbath hymn book, Sabbath hymn and tune book, was a business venture between a group of like-minded clergy and music directors like Lowell Mason. But a lot of these books were created because a new denomination was created. or there was a split in a denomination, you needed a new book to announce your new group. The kind of pocket size that was standard at the time, this particular one is from 1848. This was for the Wesleyan Methodist Connection, which was the first group of the United Methodists to break off over the slavery issue in the 1840s. There were a number of just ugly splits that happened across almost every American church leading up to the Civil War. In the 1840s is when the Methodists kind of blew apart. And the first step of that was a group of Northeastern congregations that were getting sick and tired of the central authority of the denomination trying to keep neutral, trying to keep everybody from getting mad at each other. And they finally said, you know what, slavery is wrong. We're going to go off and do our own thing. They also wanted the church to take a much stronger stance against temperance. And they also didn't like that the church had bishops as the way that they organized their authority. So you don't see a whole lot of anti-bishop hymns. But one of the things that happens in this book that is created very quickly after this group splits off is a set of anti-slavery hymns and a set of temperance hymns that show up. So a lot of these books tend to show kind of the DNA of the group that used them. Partly what they import from where they were before, but also what things are they using to innovate to get into a new space. So the last part of the book that I want to read, it's a little bit longer than what I read before, but it gives a little bit of insight into what this might have been like on the ground for a particular group. And this is, the book, as I read earlier, is split into three big sections: what's going on in churches, what's going on in schools, and what's going on in homes. And I write interludes between each of those sections to kind of bridge getting from one to the other. And so this particular interlude is moving between the church section to the school section, and that will help explain some of why it's written the way that it is. Philadelphia, 1844. In the early hours of Thursday, May 9th, 1844, the aftermaths of 3 fires glowed in a sleepless Philadelphia. For the third straight night, violent riots had rocked the city, fed by months of growing tensions between nativist, anti-Catholic organizations and resentful young men of the burgeoning Catholic communities that supplied much of Philadelphia's new industrial labor force. On Monday, nativist mobs had broken into a convent and several homes. 2 nativists and 1 Irishman were killed in related gunfire. By Wednesday, the state militia had assumed positions around the city's Catholic churches, hoping that the crowds would stand down before further blood was shed. But that night, the previously attacked convent burned, along with St. Michael's Church in the Catholic-heavy Kensington neighborhood. This was shocking enough in a city that prided itself on a history of religious pluralism and patriotism. But around 10 p.m., St. Augustine's Church on the old city's affluent North 4th Street was set ablaze, while rioters broke into the neighboring rectory and threw that building's 1,000-volume library into a bonfire, scorching the Methodist Church across the street, which still stands today, and you can see the burn marks on it. The riots left Protestants and Catholics aghast. When it appeared later that Thursday morning, the weekly issue of Philadelphia's Catholic Herald gave breathless, one-line notices of the previous night's violence, hastily added as news came in while the paper went to press. The editor lamented, quote, "Where these lawless acts are to end cannot be told," end quote. On the back page, crowded with the usual advertisements, an item from Catholic bookseller and publisher John Cunningham offered a list of books, including the Catholic Sunday School Hymn Book, for 6 1/4 cents. As it turns out, the book and the burning churches were connected by more than the pages of a newspaper. Philadelphia in 1844 was a central hub for the massive world of hymn book publishing and use. The birthplace of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the home to the AME Book Concern, their publishing arm, the city also housed the headquarters of both branches of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, which produced a wide array of hymn books for congregations, families, and schools. The American Sunday School Union, also based in Philadelphia, rivaled New York's American Bible Society and American Tract Society as the largest publisher in the United States. Not the largest religious, but the largest publisher, period, with hundreds of thousands of hymn books distributed to children and their teachers over the previous 20 years. But when Cunningham announced the publication of his cheap hymn book in a February Catholic Herald advertisement and published it later that month, it was the first American hymn book ever produced for Catholic children. Competing books soon appeared on the Catholic Herald's final page. In June, a Baltimore-produced hymn book was for sale at the shop of M. Fithian, the newspaper's publisher. In July, Philadelphia's most prominent Catholic publisher, Eugene Comiskey, announced The Sacred Wreath, designed for the Sodality of the Blessed Virgin, Philadelphia's first Catholic youth organization. The year 1844 proved to be a watershed for children's hymn books, offering a crucial new expression of minority identity and using design elements common to Protestant books, including text layout, suggestions for meter, and a first line index. This double-edged assertion of Catholic distinctiveness through Protestant design had a very specific reason for appearing when it did, one that left the future of the city's Catholic youth in question. Philadelphia's public school district had organized in the early 1830s, part of a statewide mandate passed by Governor Wolfe of Easton, that shared in a new interest in publicly provided common schools nationwide. These new schools were available to all classes, and they offered the children of laborers and immigrants access to a basic non-sectarian education. Or so the policies stipulated. In practice, by 1838, the Philadelphia schools had adopted a routine of morning exercises that included Bible reading and the singing of hymns, practices borrowed from the ASSU and its predecessors that had provided basic literacy instruction in the decades before the common schools were established. These practices drew on texts without comment that spanned the range of Protestant denominations, and Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Baptists, Methodists, and, to some extent, Quakers all saw these exercises as having less to do with churches and religion than with American public morality. For Catholics, however, reading from the King James Bible and singing hymns by Isaac Watts and Charles Wesley served to make them religious others. After years of quiet frustration, tensions quickly mounted in 1842 when a Catholic teacher in a Kensington school was fired for refusing to conduct the opening exercises. Bishop Francis Patrick Kenrick intervened later that year, arguing in an open letter to the school board that forcing Catholic students to read a Bible translation that their church rejected and to sing hymns that often deviated from their church's teachings violated the Pennsylvania state constitution. The board seemed sympathetic at first, but when Bishop Kenrick's open letter drew the ire of Protestant clergy and leaders of the growing nativist movement, the board settled for an opt-out policy in January 1843. Students could choose to leave during the exercises. The Catholic Herald soon began receiving letters from readers describing the harassment students suffered from both peers and teachers for excusing themselves from the exercises. A pre-existing problem of history textbooks including anti-Catholic accounts of colonial America, which Kenrick also had mentioned to the board, did nothing to help the situation. As frustrations mounted among Catholics over the next year, nativist organizations, such as the American Protestant Association, argued that the Bible was under siege in Philadelphia and that the very soul of the nation was at stake. Nativist groups had recently gained enough popular support to field an anti-immigrant presidential candidate in 1844. The Bible controversy, as it was known, became a campaign issue, even as Bishop Kenrick and the other editors of the Catholic Herald urged restraint and reconciliation. Up until this controversy, Philadelphia's Catholics had had more success integrating into local social institutions, such as public schools, than Catholics had in many other American cities. In New York, where nativist Bahoy culture and Irish gangs loomed larger and earlier, Bishop John Hughes had spearheaded parochial schools in his diocese in the 1830s, rejecting the public school system as inherently anti-Catholic. Philadelphia had a few elite Catholic academies, including the forerunner of Villanova, but those were too expensive for most families, and funds for parochial schools had not been forthcoming. The public schools had worked, and working-class Catholics needed them. Reconciliation was a necessity in the eyes of Kenrick's parishioners. If many families lacked school choices, they had access to the Douay-Rheims Bible in the city's several Catholic bookshops, but the school controversy highlighted a lack of available children's hymnody to counter the influence of Protestant texts. The Bible controversy explains why the hymn books finally arrived in 1844, but a brief look at the history of Roman Catholic hymn traditions is necessary to understand why the books, so widely available to Protestants for more than 100 years, were not already in the Catholic community. Like the Orthodox, Lutherans, and Moravians, Catholics had always had hymns. But after the English Reformation, Catholics in the British Isles tended to confine their hymn use to reading, usually silently. Especially in Ireland, where the Mass was forced underground, secrecy meant that singing was kept to a minimum. In places where the Mass could be celebrated more openly, choirs took charge of the hymns. The texts, Latin and translated, were widely available in missals, which gave readings for the Mass, breviaries, which contained the daily prayers of the Divine Office, and a range of lay devotional books. But there was little need for a designated Catholic hymn book, as Protestants would have understood that term. This change in the United States at the turn of the 19th century, as clergy in Boston, Baltimore, and elsewhere began to compile Protestant-style collections of hymn texts. This was partly to meet demands among continental European Catholic immigrants, many of whom had traditions of congregational singing in their countries of origin, but partly also to make Catholics look more American, that is, more Protestant. Since Protestants increasingly lived with their hymn books, carrying them between home, church, and school, Catholics sought equivalent textual support for their religious identity. It is clear how much community leaders perceived was at stake in having Catholic hymn books available. The Catholic Herald's brief notice of Cunningham's Sunday School hymn book summarized this view, quote, "It is of great importance to accustom children to the recital of pious canticles, which may fill their minds with holy thoughts and preserve them from the contaminating influence of corrupt songs." End quote. While corrupt songs was traditional shorthand for secular street ballads, a longtime target of American clergy of all persuasions, recent events also implied that Protestant hymns could corrupt the purity of Catholic piety. Cunningham's book was an antidote to that threat. Yet the design similarities between this new book and the Protestant books it resisted told another story, about integration with the Protestant mainstream. The book made a Catholic spiritual tradition available to a rising generation in the community, but in a way that also made it legible to Protestants. Like the earlier hymn books in Boston and Baltimore, the Sunday School hymn book defined a subculture by appropriating the conventions of the mainstream. Comiskey's book was even more a creature of a subculture, since the sodality his book served had organized in 1841 to give the city's Catholic youth a social space for learning how to grow up Catholic. Catholics had their own Bibles, their own school books, a Comiskey specialty, their own newspaper, their own devotional works, and now their own hymn books. That all these print genres were mirrored in the dominant Protestant culture was not lost on neighboring Protestants. One of two surviving copies of Cunningham's first edition is in the ASSU's library, now held at the Free Library of Philadelphia. And they helped Catholics, both citizens and recent immigrants, have a media environment of their own. Yet this environment enabled appropriation, even in the choice of texts. The earliest American Catholic collections included not only Protestant design elements, but also Protestant texts alongside new and ancient Catholic hymns. Watts's Before Jehovah's Awful Throne was a favorite. Charles Wesley's Jesus, Lover of My Soul, Let Me to Thy Bosom Fly also appeared widely, even before many Protestant communities could bring themselves to sing of lovers and bosoms at church. Despite fears of corrupt songs, the 1844 Catholic hymn books included several Protestant texts, and a remarkable hybrid appeared in all three of these books, a communion meditation with an opening stanza largely by the Calvinist Isaac Watts. My God, my life, my love, to thee I call. O come to me from heaven above, and be my God, my all. Watts's original would remain popular among Protestants throughout the 19th century, eventually becoming a standard in Southern shape note traditions. From the Catholic version's first appearance in Hymns for the Use of the Catholic Church in the United States of America in 1807, it gained such popularity that a tune supplement to the 1844 books, produced by Cunningham's successor John McGrath in 1850, gave 6 different tunes for the hymn, the most of any in the entire collection. Indeed, the text circulated so widely that the renowned Presbyterian hymnologist Edwin Hatfield included it alongside Watts's original version in his 1873 Chapel Hymn Book, giving Anonymous 1849 as the attribution. While the author of the Catholic version may never be known, the presence of Watts's lines, the addressing of Christ in the third stanza as "sweet lover of my soul," and other allusions and reworkings indicate that the author was well read in popular Protestant hymnody and had a keen sense for what imagery and cadences in those hymns would find a ready audience among Catholics. Thus, the hymn book became a nexus of cultural exchange, as well as a marker of denominational identity, a carrier of tradition, and a site for innovation. It was a source of prayer, of poetry, of community, and of conflict. By the time the Sacred Wreath was published, a second wave of the Bible riots convinced Philadelphia's Catholics that the time for parochial schools had come. The hymn books would move from the pluralism of public schools to these new bastions of Catholic youth identity, and these books would grow more popular in the coming days. The events of 1844 could also have been called the hymn book riots, since hymn books had been part of the conflict source and part of the Catholic community's response to discrimination and fear for the future of their children. Yet amid all the conflict, Protestants and Catholics both agreed through the rest of the 19th century that hymn books, and books drawing from those hymn books for pedagogical content, belonged in schools. So some of the places where the book goes from there is the hymns that show up in the McGuffey readers, which were widely popular in many, many schools across the country. The history of children's literature being retold as a history of hymnody. Isaac Watts's Divine and Moral Songs for Children was the #1 children's title in both England and the US in the 1700s and the 1800s. And those Alice in Wonderland fans may remember "'Tis the Voice of the Lobster" and "How Doth the Little Crocodile," which are parodies from that particular collection. And it's largely been interpreted that Lewis Carroll put those in to make fun of them, but if you read what's going on, there's a section where I talk about what's going on in the Alice in Wonderland book. What it's clear is that Carroll expects everybody who reads his book to know these texts. In fact, at one point, the Griffin corrects Alice and says, "That's not the way I learned it at school." So the joke is that Isaac Watts is even read in Wonderland. So, you know, the monsters that she encounters also know this book that she grew up reading in England. And from there it goes into the home, the way that this gets interspersed with poetry books. And there's also a chapter specifically on Emily Dickinson and the way she and her family kind of collected what we could call private hymn books, books that were meant for individual or for family reading. And she winds up using these in different ways to build her own poetic practice. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a sense of what kinds of stories are included in this book, and some of the things that I really found fascinating in finding out, you know, these books are part of our lives, not just religious, but political, literary, educational. So many different layers of our lives were packed into these books. And as the newer books lived only in religious spaces, we lost a lot of the sense of that back and forth. But recovering some of this, particularly the Philadelphia piece, you know, really helped me to see this is still the story that we're telling. You know, there were probably a number of echoes people kind of picked up in that kind of, you know, the anti-immigrant language, the religious tensions, you know, all these different things that we still see popping up in so many different ways in our society. So this is still a story of us as much as it is getting to recover something that happened before. So I'd be very happy to take any questions that people have about the book or the research or the writing or any of those dimensions. Yeah, Diane.
I just have a question about something that I should know more about, but where does the Southern Harmony fall? I think it's 1820. Where does it fall in the story of hymns?
It's a great question. So the Southern Harmony is kind of what kicks off what becomes known as the Sacred Harp tradition, or sometimes called the Shape Note singing tradition, or the Fa Sol La tradition. This was a social singing tradition that would often be a kind of a Sunday afternoon phenomenon that would spread into other kinds of social events through the course of the week. And the Southern Harmony itself comes out in the 1830s. And it's picking up a lot of these really popular texts that are making their way around a lot of these different denominational books, and then starts setting those to popular tunes, particularly in Baptist traditions and Methodist traditions. And those spread all through the South, across the West. Lowell Mason and his brother have a music publishing firm that's getting started around this time, and they get really frustrated when they start to find that they're trying to do this very elegant European style printing in New England, and they move out to Cincinnati and find that Cincinnati folks don't want any of that. They want the shape notes, they want the things that look like the Southern Harmony, because that's what people are singing from for fun out in that area. And so when his brother tries to start, say, bringing music education to Cincinnati schools and all these things, the Southern shape note tradition is what they wind up having to work with, which annoyed Lowell Mason to no end. So yeah, this tradition still sung today. There are Sacred Heart groups that meet in the Lehigh Valley. They're nationwide, they're worldwide. In fact, there are documentaries done about this phenomenon. But so this, what we tend to think of as a singing phenomenon, is very much tied in with all these different layers of, you know, what's going on in schools, what's going on in churches, what's going on in people's backyards. Yeah.
This is less of a content question, more of a process question, but I guess I'm wondering, you know, like in the preliminary stages, when you're putting things together, how do you decide, like, what things that you find interesting are going to be the topic for a longer work?
Great question. So yeah, again, I had looked at thousands of these books by the time I was writing, and kept looking at the books while I wrote. So I had a lot of reference photos of particularly these things with, say, the marginalia in them, or really interesting binding, or some design feature that I wanted to work with. I would look through those and think, okay, I think I could talk about this, talk about that. I would start to group them into possible chapters. Where might these things go? But then when I went to write this book, I did something different from how I'd been writing beforehand. I decided to draft the whole thing longhand. Before, I'd worked with computers and had my, you know, copy and paste to drop in all these little bits of research. And I realized with this book, I really wanted the stories to come forward. I had so many of these little data points, so much evidence, that I could just bury myself and my reader in that if I led with that. And so what I decided to do was look through everything, start to figure out where I thought it would go together, and then I would set all that aside and draft out the chapter, where I would put, you know, name in brackets, date in brackets, the things that I would normally stop to look up, because I wanted to keep going with the story. And as I would go, I would start to realize, oh, maybe these two things I thought were going to go in this chapter might not fit, or there's a way that I can work these in later on. So it was very much a kind of gathering and forgetting, and then regathering again kind of process to try to put it together. And I think it's one of the reasons why I get the response to this book. Some people say, you know, I absolutely love the stories here. There are academics who say, you know, why didn't you footnote more? And I've also had other readers who say, you know, this feels kind of stodgy and kind of, you know, there's too much detail. So, you know, it was kind of trying to thread a needle with all of this. But the process itself I found absolutely delightful. I loved putting the book together in that way. Bianca, did you have a question before?
I did, but I'm going to ask a different one because that was such a good question. So I kind of like to follow up on that one. Could you talk a little bit more about how that changed your process? It changed your writing and your relationship to your writing, and your thinking about yourself as a writer?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So again, it started to become a lot more about flow at that point, to just say, okay, I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to see, I probably will draft about 4 pages right now. Maybe it'll be a little bit more, and maybe it'll be a little bit less. One of the things that I loved about making that switch was I could not only have a different kind of sensory experience with it, where my hand is, you know, running across the paper as I'm doing this, you know, I'm watching the ink flow out of the page as I'm going along. The pace is different from where I type because it's slower. But also, I could do it anywhere. And a lot of this book I wound up drafting, I was on a library residency at the Library Company of Philadelphia, and then at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. And in both of those places, I could go find a library, a cafe, a park, and it didn't really matter where I went. As long as it wasn't pouring rain, I could work in that space. Turns out Worcester, at least the part of Worcester that we were renting our house in, had a lot of shopping malls that were kind of on the way out. Those are great writing spaces They're quiet, there's benches everywhere, and so sometimes I would just walk out to this one that was about a half mile from where we were staying, and I would just sit and write there, and realizing that I could get away from the screen and start to make writing much more a part of what it felt like to be part of my life, rather than, okay, I go do my work on my computer and then I step away and there are other things going. I can go on a walk and stop and write. I can run errands and I can stop in the middle of that and write. And that's still something that I keep enjoying and playing with what I'm doing, and realizing that I used to be very much what writers call a basher, where I would gather research and just sit down and blitz 25 pages in a week, drafting out, and then I would need like 3 days to recover. And this new process made it a lot easier for me to say, okay, I have an actual writing practice that's going along, where it's not just kind of building up a head of steam, getting everything out at once, and then just kind of collapsing. But to say, I can actually just kind of go about my life and keep writing. And that's, been in some way maybe the best discovery out of all of this stuff. I loved the things I was finding in the libraries, but finding that out about myself, that this is another way I could be a writer, is maybe the best thing that's come of this whole process. Yeah, thanks for asking.
Just follows up on that again, but do you think that sort of like separation from technology had any implications for the way that you're writing about, like, these handwritten notes that you're finding in margins and things like that?
That's really interesting. Yeah, because I'm definitely getting a lot closer to how these particular things were made. I was more conscious as I was, because I had to think about my own tools so much to make sure, okay, does my pen still have ink in it? Did I put the right manuscript book in my bag? Those kinds of things, to realize, for instance, when I say, these people who are writing the dates, well, you have to keep pencils around to do that. And that seems super obvious, but if you're sitting in church and you're thinking, man, I would have liked to have written a note, and you don't have anything around, then nothing gets recorded. So it's like there are tools that are part of it. There are materials that are part of this. And so just trying to think through how people are not just using the books, but they're gathering other stuff around the books, like pencils and pens and other books that they may want to reference. There are a lot of these books where people will note cross references, like, oh, I noticed that it was this in this hymn book and it's different in this one. There's a kind of there's a constellation of objects and practices that all swirl around all of this. And I think by the time I was in the middle of the project, it was pretty clear to me that's really what the story is. Like, it seems that the story is about objects, but it's really about these kinds of these things people and their objects do together. All right, well, thanks one and all for coming out on this gorgeous day. And thrilled that I could share this with you.